The newsroom lights flickered against a backdrop of red and blue, the glare of police sirens still haunting the quiet streets of Rowan County. A stern anchor's voice broke the silence. Just as today, 6 years after a girl vanished into thin air, after years of lies, years of silence, we finally know what happened to Erica Parsons. The words echoed with a finality that chilled viewers across North Carolina. This wasn't just another missing child case. It was a story of betrayal, secrecy, and the horrifying reality of what can fester inside the walls of a home that pretends to be normal. Imagine this. A 13-year-old girl disappears from her family home, and for 2 entire years, 24 long months, no one says a word to the authorities. No Amber Alert, no police report, not even a desperate phone call from a parent. She simply vanishes. And when someone finally walks into a police station, the truth that begins to unravel is darker than anyone could have prepared for. The question explodes in every viewer's mind. How could a child vanish for years and no one sound the alarm? The girl at the center of this tragedy was Erica Parsons. Born in 1998, her life began with fragility. Her biological mother, overwhelmed and unstable, handed her over to relatives, an aunt and uncle, Casey and Sandy Parsons. On the surface, it sounded like a blessing, a chance for the baby girl to have stability, to grow up in a home filled with siblings and laughter. But beneath that veneer lay something cruel. The walls of the Parsons' modest home on Miller Chapel Road did not cradle Erica with love. They became her prison. Neighbors saw little of her. School officials barely registered her name before she was pulled out and claimed to be homeschooled. And those who did know her often described her as quiet, painfully shy, a child who lingered in the background as if afraid of being noticed. Yet no one could have imagined the secret torment that was being concealed behind closed doors. Casey and Sandy were not saviors. They were tormentors, masquerading as parents, hiding their cruelty under layers of deception. This opening news report, framed against the flashing lights of patrol cars and the image of the dilapidated Parsons home, sets the stage for the horror to come. The voice of the anchor is unrelenting, drilling the facts into the audience. She was only a child, just 13, and her life was snuffed out long before anyone bothered to ask where she had gone. Each word hammers in the gravity of what was lost. Erica's story is not the kind that shocks because it happened suddenly in one violent night. It shocks because of the silence. It shocks because of the length of time. For nearly 2 years, her absence passed unnoticed by the very people who should have loved her, protected her, searched for her. And when her name was finally spoken aloud inside a police station, it wasn't by her adoptive parents. It was her brother Jaime, carrying the unbearable weight of truth, who finally exposed the silence. But before that moment of revelation, before the lies would unravel, there was only the chilling reality. Erica had been gone since November of 2011, and nobody outside her family even knew. The home where she once lived stood like a hollow shell, its faded walls holding secrets too grotesque to imagine. The camera pans across its porch, its windows dark, as though the house itself refuses to speak. Who was Erica? She wasn't just a name in a headline. She was a baby girl born into a world already stacked against her. She was handed over by a mother who hoped her relatives would give her a better chance. She was a child who grew up surrounded by siblings but was never truly part of them. She was the girl always pushed aside, always hidden, until she disappeared altogether. In that opening scene, the story grips the viewer by the throat. It asks not only what happened to Erica, but how so many adults, neighbors, teachers, relatives, could fail her for so long. The chilling news broadcast reminds us that justice may have come 6 years late, but for Erica, it would never come soon enough. And as the voice of the reporter fades, the question lingers like smoke in the cold night air. How could a child vanish for years and the world simply carry on? This isn't just the opening of a case file. It's the beginning of a descent into a nightmare that will reveal just how far cruelty can go when cloaked in the disguise of family, and how silence can kill just as surely as violence. For viewers, those first 3 minutes become a warning. Nothing about this case is ordinary. It's not just a murder. It's a betrayal of the most sacred trust, that of a child in the hands of her parents. And it is here, in this chilling opening, that the story of Erica Parsons truly begins. The house on Miller Chapel Road looked ordinary from the outside. A single-story home with weathered siding and a porch that creaked under footsteps. To the neighbors, it blended into the quiet landscape of Rowan County, just another modest southern home. But inside those walls, the reality was anything but ordinary. For Erica Lynn Parsons, that house was not a sanctuary. It was a place of torment, a prison disguised as family. From the time she could walk and talk, Erica's presence was treated as unwanted, while other children in the Parsons household played, laughed, and lived as though they belonged. Erica was the shadow in the corner, thin, pale, and shrinking further into herself with each passing day. She wasn't allowed to join in. She wasn't allowed to simply be a child. Her meals were not the dinners her siblings enjoyed around the table. They were scraps, sometimes dog food, sometimes garbage pulled from the trash can. Food was never nourishment for Erica. It was punishment. At night, when her siblings went to bed, Erica often curled on the floor or inside a dark closet. Her room was sometimes nothing more than four walls that shut her away from the world. If she dared relieve herself out of desperation, the punishment only grew harsher. Imagine a child locked away, too scared to breathe too loudly. A child who longed to be loved but was treated like a burden too heavy to carry. Neighbors recalled hearing odd noises through the thin walls of the Parsons home. A cry, a thud, a muffled voice that seemed to plead before being silenced. But no one knocked on the door. No one picked up the phone to call social services. In communities like this, people often told themselves it was none of their business, or perhaps they feared retribution. Silence became complicity. Erica's suffering was hidden not just by her parents' lies, but also by the collective decision of those around her to look away. Casey Parsons, the woman Erica called her mother, was the architect of this torment. In her eyes, Erica was never truly hers. She was a reminder of sacrifice, a responsibility she didn't want. Casey's treatment of Erica was laced with disdain, a cruelty that went beyond discipline. She lashed out with words, with fists, with cold detachment. The other children were permitted warmth, even affection. Erica was met with scorn. She was told not to call Casey Mom, ordered instead to address her by name, as though stripping away even the illusion of motherhood. To Casey, Erica wasn't a daughter, she was a target. Sandy Parsons, the father figure in the home, stood by and let it happen. His silence was not born of ignorance. He saw, he heard, he knew, but he chose not to intervene. When Casey berated Erica, when she struck her with a belt buckle or bent her fingers back in cruelty, Sandy's reaction was not to stop it, but to turn away. His indifference became another weapon. To a child desperate for someone, anyone to defend her, his refusal was its own form of violence. In the daylight, Erica's thin frame betrayed her suffering. She moved through the house like a ghost, her skin sallow, her arms marked by bruises that were explained away with careless lies. She fell. Her brother did it. It's just an accident. But the injuries told a different story, one that words could never fully conceal. Every scar on her body was a silent testimony of the life she was forced to endure. For Erica, the world outside her door might as well have been another planet. She rarely ventured into the yard, rarely interacted with children her age. Isolation was both punishment and control. When family vacations came, she was left behind. While her siblings splashed in the ocean or built sandcastles, Erica stayed hidden at home, instructed not to speak, not to make her presence known. Even in her own family, she was erased. What makes this chapter of Erica's life unbearable to recount is not just the brutality itself, but the deliberate nature of it. This wasn't neglect born of poverty or ignorance. It was cruelty chosen day after day. Casey fashioned herself as a tyrant within those walls, ensuring that Erica understood she was unwanted. Sandy, by his passivity, reinforced the message: you are not worthy of love, not worthy of protection, not even worthy of acknowledgement. In cinematic terms, imagine the camera drifting through the Parsons home, the laughter of children in one room, and then the lens pans to a dim corner where Erica sits alone, her knees pulled to her chest, trying to disappear. In another moment, the scene cuts to the outside porch at night. A neighbor pauses, hearing a strange sound, something like a muffled cry. The neighbor shakes their head, pulls the curtains shut, and turns off the light. That single act of indifference mirrors the larger failure of everyone who could have stepped in but didn't. The tragedy of Erica Parsons is rooted in this stage of her life. Before the lies, before the disappearance, before the headlines, there was a little girl living in terror inside her own home. A child who never got to experience the warmth of a bedtime story, who never knew what it felt like to be tucked in, who instead faced hunger, humiliation, and violence. And every day, she was reminded that, in the eyes of her so-called parents, she was nothing more than a burden they resented, but still exploited. By the time Erica was 13, her body was frail, her spirit nearly extinguished. To look at her was to see a child fading, a child marked by neglect and pain. And as the story pushes forward, the realization sharpens. The disappearance that would shock the world didn't begin in 2011. The slow erasure of Erica Parsons had been happening long before. It began the moment she was placed in that house that called itself a family, but functioned as a cage. Her childhood was not stolen in an instant. It was dismantled piece by piece, in every cruel order, in every beating, in every night spent on the floor. And in those years of torment, the seeds of the darkest chapter of her story were already being sown. In November of 2011, Erica Parsons vanished from the world. One day she was there, thin, frail, quietly moving through the shadows of her home, and then she was gone. No police report was filed, no community search was launched, no desperate plea was made to the media. Instead, her adoptive parents, Casey and Sandy Parsons, unveiled a story so convenient, so calculated, that it cloaked her absence in silence. They told anyone who asked that Erica had been sent to live with her grandmother, a woman they called Nan Goodman, in Asheville, North Carolina. At first, the explanation seemed simple enough to those who were willing to accept it. Children are sometimes moved around in fractured families. Perhaps Erica was better off with relatives, people thought. But when held up to the light, the story began to crumble almost immediately. Who was this woman, Nan Goodman? Why had no one ever met her? Why was there no phone number, no address, no document to prove that Erica was now in her care? In any legitimate custody transfer, especially one involving a minor, paperwork would have been filed, authorities notified, and some kind of legal trail established. But there was nothing. Only words. Only lies. The chilling logic raises itself like a red flag. If a child is truly handed over to another guardian, why was there no signature on a form, no school enrollment records, no medical files following her? The law demands accountability when it comes to the welfare of a child. Here there was none. This wasn't a transfer of guardianship. This was a cover-up. Behind the closed doors of the Parsons house, the truth was darker than fiction. The family continued as if nothing had changed. The other children went about their routines, the house remained as still as ever, and Casey and Sandy ensured the outside world believed Erica was safe somewhere else. Meanwhile, every month a check for over $600 in government assistance, money intended for Erica's care, was deposited into their account. Her disappearance wasn't reported because admitting she was gone would mean losing that income. In that sense, Erica had been transformed from a daughter into currency, her silence converted into profit. The image is suffocating, a house with its blinds drawn tight, a mailbox still stuffed with government checks, and neighbors who wondered but never pressed too hard. There were whispers, questions that floated quietly through the community, but they were never loud enough to pierce the shield of secrecy. The Parsons story about Nan Goodman was bizarre but difficult to disprove without a direct confrontation. People in small towns often prefer not to interfere, even when something feels wrong. And so, the lie lived on, as Erica's absence stretched from days to weeks, and then to years. In cinematic form, the scene is stark. Picture the house on a cold winter evening. The windows are dark, no laughter spilling out, no sound of a child's footsteps. The camera pushes in closer, pausing on the locked door, then shifts to the kitchen table where an envelope sits, stamped with government insignia. Money for a child, no longer there. The family eats dinner, the children chatter, but there's an empty chair that no one acknowledges. That absence is the loudest thing in the room. What makes this part of Erica's story so unsettling is not just her disappearance, but the deliberate orchestration of it. Casey, the mother figure, controlled the narrative. She spun the lie about Nan with confidence, repeating it until it became second nature. Sandy, quiet and compliant, reinforced the story with his silence. Together, they built a fiction strong enough to shield them from suspicion for a time. But beneath that veneer, the community was beginning to feel the weight of unease. How could an entire child simply vanish? Why did no one see her again? Each unanswered question became another stone pressing down on the chest of the small town. The dissonance between the Parsons story and reality grew wider, creating a tension that gnawed at those who had known Erica, however briefly. They couldn't shake the sense that something unspeakable had happened inside that home, something being hidden in plain sight. This was not just a missing child case. It was a puzzle with missing pieces that didn't quite fit. A grandmother who didn't exist, parents who clung to a lie, government money still flowing in, and a silence that screamed louder with each day that passed. By the end of 2011, Erica had already been erased from daily life. Yet the machine of deceit kept turning, fueled by greed and indifference, while the world outside went on unaware. The disappearance of Erica Parsons is not marked by the drama of sirens blaring or search parties combing the woods. Instead, it is marked by the suffocating stillness of a secret, the quiet hum of checks being cashed, and the unsettling realization that a child could vanish in a neighborhood full of people, and somehow no one, not the family, not the neighbors, not the authorities, demanded answers. It is in that silence, in that deliberate erasure, that the true horror of Erica's disappearance is revealed. The doors of the Rowan County Sheriff's Office creaked open on a humid summer morning in July 2013. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as a young man walked in with shoulders hunched and eyes heavy with something far deeper than fatigue. His name was Jamie Parsons, and beside him stood his uncle Scott, a man who had been pressing him to do the unthinkable, speak the truth. What Jamie carried with him that day was not just a story, it was a confession, one that would fracture his family and send ripples through the entire community. When he sat down with investigators, his words came slowly at first, heavy, reluctant. But then he said it plainly, and the room froze. I haven't seen my sister Erica since 2011. 2 years. 2 long years without a trace of a 13-year-old girl. To the officers across the table, the weight of those words was like a blow. A child doesn't simply vanish for 2 years without someone reporting it. But here was a brother, young and visibly broken, admitting that the silence had gone on far too long. The detectives leaned in, their pens halting over notepads. What do you mean you haven't seen her? One asked. Jamie swallowed hard, his hands twisting in his lap. He explained that his parents, Casey and Sandy, had insisted Erica was living with her grandmother, the same fabricated Nan Goodman. But deep down, Jamie knew it was a lie. And worse, he carried within him a torment that ate away at his conscience. He had seen, he had heard, he had participated in the cruelty that defined Erica's short life. This was the first true breaking point in the case, the first time the truth forced its way through years of deception. The officers in that small interview room realized immediately what they were hearing wasn't just a missing child report. It was an indictment of silence, of neglect, of abuse so systemic it had gone unnoticed and unchallenged by nearly everyone around. They were not just looking for a girl. They were staring into a case of unimaginable betrayal. For Jamie, speaking up meant turning against his own parents. It meant unraveling the story he had been forced to carry, a story he had been complicit in by his silence. And layered beneath his fear was guilt. Guilt that he hadn't protected Erica, guilt that he had sometimes followed the orders to strike her, to isolate her, to treat her not as a sister, but as an enemy. He was, after all, still a child himself when these horrors unfolded. And children obey the adults who control them. But the memory of his sister's suffering weighed on him like chains. And that morning in 2013, he decided he could no longer bear it. In cinematic terms, the scene unfolds with quiet intensity. The camera lingers on Jaime's trembling hands, his eyes flicking between the officers and the floor as though ashamed to meet anyone's gaze. Uncle Scott sits stiffly beside him, his face grim, urging Jaime with a nod to keep talking. And as the words spill out, the officers exchange glances, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm, then to grim determination. A missing girl, never reported. A lie about a grandmother who didn't exist, Abuse so brutal that even siblings were coerced into becoming instruments of it. The silence in that interrogation room was deafening after Jaime finished. The weight of his statement hung in the air, pressing down on everyone present. For the first time, someone had pierced the veil that Casey and Sandy Parsons had built around their household. For the first time, Erica's name was spoken in a place where truth mattered, where lies could not hold. But while Jaime had broken the silence, his heart was far from relieved. In telling the truth, he was forced to confront his own role. He remembered the nights when he turned away from her cries, the moments when he obeyed his mother's commands to hurt her, the one time when his own blow had broken Erica's arm. The memory gnawed at him. He could see her small frame, her eyes dull with pain, her lips pressed together to keep from crying out. And the guilt carved into him the understanding that by obeying, by staying silent, he had been part of the machinery that destroyed her. Yet here he was, trying to undo at least part of that damage. For investigators, this was the first tremor before the quake, the revelation that pushed the case from whispers into action. For Jamie, it was both an act of betrayal against the parents who raised him and an act of redemption for the sister he failed to protect. In those 3 minutes of film time, the story reaches its first major turning point. The viewers feel the shock ripple through the police station, the anger of officers realizing how long this child had been gone, and the crushing guilt Jaime carries as he relives the horrors he had witnessed. It is the moment when the silence shatters, when the audience realizes that what lies ahead is not a search for a runaway, but the unearthing of a nightmare hidden in plain sight. Jaime's words ignite the investigation, and from here, nothing will ever be the same again. Detectives began peeling back the layers of the Parsons story with precision, and very quickly the cracks widened into chasms. The first blow to Casey and Sandy's tale was simple but devastating. There was no Nan Goodman. She did not exist. The so-called grandmother in Asheville, who supposedly took Erica in, was nothing more than a fabrication. And the supposed real grandmother, Irene, had in fact died in 2005, years before Erica's disappearance. The logic was inescapable. If the person who was supposed to be raising Erica had been dead for nearly a decade, then where was the girl? The revelation landed like a thunderclap. For investigators, it was proof that the Parsons story was not just flimsy, but deliberately false. For the community, it was the first public indication that something much darker was at play. What kind of parents invent a caretaker who doesn't exist? What kind of people craft a lie so absurd, yet cling to it as if it could shield them forever? When confronted, Casey faltered. Her answers shifted, slippery as oil. At times, she claimed she'd been misled, tricked by someone pretending to be Nan. Other times, she insisted she had spoken to the woman through Facebook, though she could never provide a phone number, an address, or even the profile itself. Each word unraveled her credibility further, exposing a desperate attempt to control a narrative that was already collapsing. Sandy, by contrast, chose silence. He sat through questioning sessions, eyes down, lips sealed, a man complicit through refusal. His silence screamed louder than any confession. As the lies cracked open, the investigation deepened. The FBI joined local authorities, bringing resources, manpower, and expertise. With federal agents combing through every corner of the Parsons world, there was no more hiding. The search warrants were executed with clinical precision. Officers descended on the Miller Chapel Road property, blocking off the road, filling the quiet street with flashing lights and the low hum of generators as forensic teams prepared to dig. The image was surreal. A modest suburban yard transformed into a crime scene. Neighbors pressed against the yellow tape, whispering, watching as officers fanned out across the property. Metal detectors swept back and forth, shovels dug into the soil, dogs sniffed at the air. The sound of shovels biting into dirt was captured on camera, a haunting rhythm underscoring the possibility that a child's grave might be beneath the earth. Every clump of soil lifted was filmed, every movement documented. The world watched as the facade of the Parsons home cracked wide open. Inside the house, the findings were just as disturbing. Forensic teams pulled sections of drywall from closets, each marked with suspicious stains. One patch revealed a smear of dried red, the kind of stain that makes the air grow heavy with dread. A pair of jeans with dark stains was collected. A plastic bag filled with magazines and notes about another murdered child JonBenet Ramsey, was unearthed, raising chilling questions about Casey's state of mind. Each item became another piece in a growing puzzle, one that painted a horrifying portrait of obsession, cruelty, and cover-up. The search extended beyond the home. Investigators pried open a storage unit linked to Sandy Parsons, a place meant to hold forgotten furniture and boxes. What they found instead was macabre: fragments of a vacuum cleaner, broken beyond use, and human teeth. Human teeth, sitting in a storage space rented by the very man who claimed his stepdaughter was safe with a phantom grandmother. The discovery rattled even seasoned investigators. It was not just evidence of abuse, it was evidence that Erica's body had been destroyed, piece by piece, her existence erased with chilling calculation. The camera of this story pans between scenes of officials digging under floodlights, evidence bags lined on tables, and agents whispering to one another with faces carved in stone. The weight of what they were uncovering was immense. They weren't just chasing a runaway, they weren't just untangling a family feud, they were standing in the epicenter of a crime that had been meticulously hidden for years. By the end of these searches, one fact was undeniable. Erica Parsons had not left voluntarily. She had not gone to live with a grandmother. She had been silenced, her body concealed, her absence explained away by a story so absurd that it collapsed under the first touch of scrutiny. The curtain had been pulled back, and behind it was not just neglect, not just fraud, but the cold reality of violence and death. This was the first major crescendo of the investigation, the moment the world saw the truth with stark clarity. The Parsons lies, once whispered and rehearsed, now lay exposed under the harsh glare of evidence. A family's carefully woven fiction had been shredded, and in its place stood the horrifying reality. Erica was gone, and those who were supposed to protect her had orchestrated every step of her erasure. The walls of the interrogation room echoed with voices that carried more than memory. They carried guilt, grief, and a truth too heavy to bear. When Jamie Parsons began to recount what life inside that house had been, his words cut like glass. He spoke of nights when Erica was locked in a closet, left to whimper in the dark, of meals denied, and punishments so grotesque they could only be described as torture. He confessed to moments when he, still a boy himself, was ordered to strike his sister. And though his voice shook, he admitted he obeyed, because disobedience in that house meant becoming the next target. He remembered the day Erica's arm was broken. She screamed, a sound that still haunted him, and instead of rushing her to a hospital, Casey sent Brooke and Jaime to buy supplies at Walmart. A splint, some bandages, a way to patch her up without alerting anyone outside. Jaime's voice faltered as he described the way her arm never healed properly, the way she winced each time she moved it afterward. It wasn't just cruelty, it was erasure. The deliberate act of ensuring Erica's pain remained invisible to the world. Brooke, too, carried her burden into the room. Her testimony painted a picture of a girl who lived as an outsider under her own roof. Brooke described watching Erica forced to stand for hours, nose pressed into the corner, while her siblings went about their day. If a visitor arrived, Erica would be hidden, her presence denied. Brooke's words trembled, but the horror in them was steady. Their mother, Casey, didn't merely neglect Erica, she despised her. Every action seemed designed to strip her of dignity, to make her smaller, weaker, less human. And then came Sadie, the youngest, her voice soft, almost breaking, as she shared a memory that no child should carry. She told investigators how she sometimes tried to sneak food to her sister, tiny bits of bread, scraps from her plate, whenever she could. "I just wanted her to eat something," Sadie whispered. That single line, so fragile yet so powerful, collapsed the distance between evidence and empathy. In that one sentence, viewers could see the heartbreaking reality. Even children in the household recognized that Erica was starving. The image of a little girl hiding crumbs for her older sister crystallized the cruelty in a way no forensic report ever could. From these testimonies, the portrait of Erica before she disappeared took shape. She wasn't just missing, she was already fading long before November 2011. Witnesses described her as thin, to the point of frailty, her skin ashen, her eyes hollow, sunken into her face. She moved like a shadow, too weak to protest, too conditioned to expect anything different. The Erica they remembered was not the lively, curious teenager she should have been. She was a ghost in the making, her body betraying the abuse she had endured, her spirit ground down by relentless cruelty. The more the stories piled up, the clearer it became. Erica didn't vanish because she ran away or because she found another home. Erica had been killed inside that house long before her body was ever buried. The abuse, the isolation, the starvation, each was a slow dismantling of her existence. The witnesses weren't just describing acts of violence. They were describing the process of a child being erased by the very people who were meant to protect her. The emotional crescendo of this section lies in the juxtaposition. On one side, the stark details of cruelty, being forced to eat dog food, having her fingers bent back until they nearly snapped, sleeping on the floor without a bed. On the other side, the tiny gestures of defiance and compassion, Sadie sneaking food, Brooke remembering the way Erica's eyes pleaded silently for mercy. These fragments of humanity stood as proof that even in her torment, Erica's suffering was seen. The tragedy is that no one acted soon enough. For the investigators listening, for the jury that would later hear these accounts, for the audience watching this story unfold, the weight of these testimonies was unbearable. It was no longer a question of whether Erica was alive somewhere. It was a realization that she had likely died in that very house, under conditions too cruel for imagination. In cinematic terms, the sequence plays out as a mosaic of memories. Jamie's face pale under the harsh light, Brooke's eyes glassy with regret, Sadie's small hands twisting nervously as she whispers about sneaking food. Intercut with these words are reconstructed visuals. Erica's thin frame hunched in a corner, her arm dangling awkwardly after being broken, her face illuminated by a sliver of light through a closet door. These are not dramatizations. They are the truths ripped from the mouths of those who lived inside that home. By the time the testimonies end, the viewer is left with a suffocating certainty. Erica was not just missing, she was systematically destroyed. Each account adds another nail to the coffin of denial. Each word pushes the audience closer to the grim understanding that her death did not happen in a distant forest or at the hands of a stranger. It happened here, in her so-called home, in the place that should have been her refuge. The silence is broken, the veil lifted, and the horror undeniable. Erica Parsons was murdered long before the world realized she was gone. The year was 2016, and after years of silence, years of deflection, the truth finally clawed its way to the surface. Sandy Parsons, the adoptive father who had sat mute through questioning after questioning, agreed to speak. Not with compassion, not with courage, but with the hollow resignation of a man who could no longer carry the weight of what had been buried. Literally. His words guided investigators to a desolate stretch of woods in Chesterfield County, South Carolina. It was there, he said, that Erica's body lay. The scene unfolded like a sequence from a bleak film. A cold rain drifted from a gray sky, soaking the dirt road that led into the forest. Police vehicles lined the narrow path, red and blue lights flickering in the mist. Officers moved with grim purpose, their boots sinking into the mud as they carried shovels, evidence bags, and cameras. The forest was silent except for the steady patter of rain and the metallic scrape of tools being unloaded. The air was thick with tension, as though the trees themselves knew what horror lay beneath their roots. Sandy, flanked by law enforcement, shuffled forward, his shackled hands trembling slightly. He pointed to a spot, an unremarkable patch of earth covered with leaves and rainwater. To anyone else, it was just another stretch of forest floor. But for the investigators who had spent years chasing shadows, this was the place where silence ended. Shovels pierced the ground. The sound of metal striking wet soil carried through the woods, sharp and unrelenting. Camera lights illuminated the pit as clumps of earth were pulled away, inch by inch. And then it happened. A fragment emerged, fragile and pale against the dark mud. A bone. A child's remains, preserved in the ground for nearly 5 years, now exposed to the world. Officers paused, their faces tightening with the weight of the discovery. Even the most seasoned among them struggled to hold composure. The silence was no longer the silence of secrecy. It was the silence of mourning, of respect, of grief for a child who had been discarded like she was nothing. The forensic examination that followed stripped away any remaining illusion. Erica's body told a story more damning than any testimony could. Her bones were brittle, showing signs of severe malnutrition. Multiple fractures, in different stages of healing, marked her skeleton, an arm, ribs, a leg. Each break was a sentence in the chronicle of her abuse. Her teeth bore signs of neglect, some missing, others cracked. The forensic report was clinical, but behind its sterile language lay the truth. Erica had endured prolonged, systematic violence. Her body was the canvas of her suffering. It was the ultimate crescendo in the story, a revelation that confirmed what investigators and family members had feared but could not prove. Erica had not been living in Asheville with a mythical grandmother. She had not run away, she had died in 2011, a frail 13-year-old girl broken by years of abuse and neglect, and buried in a shallow grave by the very people who were supposed to protect her. For 5 long years, while her adoptive parents lied, collected money, and deflected questions, Erica existed only as a ghost, a missing name, a face on a poster, a question mark haunting the community. The cinematic imagery of that discovery remains indelible. The rain-soaked forest, the row of patrol cars like mourners, officers kneeling in the mud, carefully lifting fragile bones from the earth. The heavy silence as evidence bags filled with the remnants of a girl who had been denied her childhood, denied her dignity, denied even the right to be remembered properly. What makes this moment the emotional and narrative peak is not simply the discovery of remains, it is the collision of truth and denial. For years, Casey and Sandy Parsons insisted on their lies. For years, they perpetuated the myth of Nan Goodman. But the earth does not lie. The bones do not lie. The truth was there all along, waiting for the day someone would be brave or desperate enough to dig. For the investigators, it was vindication and devastation all at once. They had found what they were looking for, but it was not the ending anyone wanted. For Erica's biological mother, Carolyn, the confirmation was a blade. She had clung to hope that her daughter might still be alive somewhere, hidden but breathing. That hope ended in the mud of South Carolina, replaced by a grief that would never truly fade. For the audience, the revelation is crushing. The story shifts from suspicion to certainty, from shadows to stark light. Erica Parsons, the girl whose name was whispered in worry, was no longer a missing child. She was a victim of murder, silenced in 2011, erased for 5 years, remembered only as a ghost until the rain-soaked ground finally gave her back. The truth had been buried with her, but now it was unearthed for all to see. And once seen, it could never be forgotten. By 2019, the case that had haunted Rowan County for nearly a decade reached its inevitable climax in a courtroom filled with tension, so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Casey Parsons, the adoptive mother whose lies had once convinced neighbors and even social workers that Erica was safely living with a grandmother who didn't exist, now stood shackled before a judge. Gone was the carefully composed woman who had spun story after story. What remained was a hollow figure, cornered by truth, stripped of her manipulations. Her plea was entered without flourish, guilty to first-degree murder. The consequence? Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The words landed in the room like iron chains. For years, Casey had treated Erica as a nuisance, a burden, an inconvenience to be discarded. Now the law discarded her, permanently locking her away where her lies could harm no one else. The sentence carried a finality that even her most venomous lies could not undo. It was not redemption, it was not justice fully realized. Nothing could restore Erica's life, but it was accountability, carved into stone by the court. Beside her, Sandy Parsons faced his own reckoning. Unlike Casey, he pled guilty to second-degree murder, acknowledging his role in a death he had once tried to bury in silence, in soil. His punishment? 33 years in prison. For a man already broken by age and infamy, the sentence was a lifetime in its own right. The courtroom was not merciful, nor was it cruel. It was unrelenting. Both Casey and Sandy were handed the lives they had taken from Erica, stolen years transformed into prison bars. And then came the words that defined the trial. The judge's voice, deliberate and sharp, cut through the stillness. Erica was only a little girl, a child who wanted nothing more than love. Instead, she was given cruelty, neglect, and death. The statement was not merely legal language. It was a moral verdict, a reminder to everyone present that this was not just another case file. This was a child whose smile was extinguished by the very people who were supposed to protect it. At that moment, all eyes turned to the gallery, where Erica's biological mother, Carolyn, sat. Her face was streaked with tears, her body shaking with a storm of grief and fury that had been bottled for years. She had entrusted her daughter to Casey and Sandy, believing she was giving her a chance at stability. That decision now weighed on her like a curse. She wept openly, her cries echoing through the courtroom, raw and unrestrained. Between sobs, she found her voice, thin, trembling, but laced with fire. She looked at Casey and Sandy and called them what she believed they had always been: monsters. The word hung in the air, unchallenged. Because in that courtroom, no one could deny it. They were not simply flawed parents, not merely negligent caretakers. They had crossed into something darker, something crueler. They had stripped a child of food, of dignity, of her very life, and buried her in lies as much as in soil. Carolyn's outburst was not just anger, it was a demand for recognition, that the system, the court, and the world acknowledge the enormity of what had been taken from her and from Erica. This moment of confrontation was not just mother against murderers. It was the confrontation of love against hatred, of grief against cruelty, of humanity against inhumanity. The courtroom became a stage for a final reckoning, where words replaced fists, where truth finally silenced deception. The image of Carolyn, broken yet unyielding in her condemnation, underscored what no sentence could ever fully resolve. Erica's death was irreversible, and the scars it left on those who loved her would never heal. Yet there was a sense of closure, however imperfect. For years, Erica had been voiceless, her suffering hidden behind locked doors, her death hidden in the ground. In this trial, her story was told. Her name was spoken again and again, not as a missing child, not as a rumor, but as a victim whose life mattered. The sentences handed down to Casey and Sandy ensured that Erica would not be forgotten, that her abusers would never again walk freely, never again hide behind lies. The trial did not deliver peace, but it delivered truth. And in a story built on silence and deception, truth was the most powerful weapon left. The courtroom may have emptied, the sentences may have been filed, but one memory lingered: a mother's tears, a judge's words, and the undeniable reality that a little girl named Erica Parsons had finally at last been seen. In 2017, 6 years after she vanished and 5 years before the courts would render their final judgment, the community finally gathered for Erica Parsons' funeral. It was not a grand affair. There were no gilded caskets or polished marble headstones waiting to welcome her. What stood in their place was something far more human, far more powerful. A circle of people holding candles, their faces softened by the flickering glow. Friends, neighbors, police officers, and strangers who had followed her story came together, not just to mourn, but to bear witness. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the Carolina night, whispering prayers into the cold air, ensuring that Erica's name would never again be silenced by the cruelty of those who betrayed her. Among them was Carolyn Parsons, Erica's biological mother. For years, she had carried a weight few could comprehend, a mother's regret for a choice that had unwittingly delivered her daughter into the hands of monsters. That night, Carolyn's voice trembled as she addressed the mourners, her words cutting through the hush of the crowd. "My child was a gift, a precious soul. I will never allow her to be forgotten." It was not a plea, it was a vow, spoken with the raw finality of a woman who had seen her daughter taken twice, once by lies and once by death. Her grief was naked, but so too was her defiance. The candles shimmered like a constellation pulled down to earth, each flame a silent confession from those who wished they had acted sooner, spoken louder, intervened more bravely. This was no ordinary vigil. It was a reckoning. Every flicker symbolized the acknowledgement that the system had failed Erica, that neighbors, teachers, agencies, and family had missed signs or ignored them, that in the silence of indifference, abuse thrived. Erica had not died simply because of Casey and Sandy's cruelty. She had died because a community had been too quiet, too trusting, too willing to believe lies instead of asking hard questions. As the vigil swelled with song and sobs, the story of Erica Parsons transformed. She was no longer just the child hidden away, starved, beaten, discarded. She was the child whose memory had forced a county, a state, perhaps even a nation, to stare uncomfortably at its own passivity. The image of her small frame, her hollow eyes, was now inseparable from the broader message. Silence is complicity. Abuse thrives in shadows, and shadows grow when people look away. A narrator's voice, steady, almost cinematic in its gravity, seemed to rise above the candles and prayers. Erica's story is not just a tragedy, it is a warning. When society stays silent in the face of abuse, when whispers are ignored and signs dismissed, victims are left with nothing but invisible cries. These words echoed not as narration alone, but as indictment. Every listener, every viewer of her story was called to reflect. How many Ericas had been overlooked? How many children were still hidden in plain sight? The vigil closed with a gesture as simple as it was devastating. The crowd fell into silence, and one by one, the candles were extinguished. Darkness reclaimed the night, but it was not the same darkness that had once concealed Erica's suffering. This was a chosen darkness, a symbolic acknowledgement of the years she spent unseen. As the final candle sputtered out, the screen of memory shifted, and a single phrase appeared, stark against the void: justice for Erica Parsons. It was not merely a closing statement. It was a declaration, a promise that her death would not dissolve into statistics or vanish into forgotten headlines. It was a charge to parents, neighbors, lawmakers, teachers, and every bystander who might one day hold the chance to intervene. Erica's voice had been silenced, but her story became an alarm bell ringing across the years, urging vigilance, empathy, and the courage to speak when silence feels safer. The end of her story is not just an ending, it is a haunting reminder stitched into the conscience of all who know it. Erica Parsons will forever remain that small girl who longed for love and found cruelty instead, but whose memory compels the world to refuse silence. Her candle may have burned out, but its glow lingers, demanding that others never again be left to die in the shadows.